On episode 120 of the Vincast, I speak with Jim Chatto, winemaker at McWilliams Mount Pleasant, Chatto Wines, and recently appointed the head winemaker for Kreglinger Wine Estates. Hello there, Vincasters. Welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and it is very, very exciting to share with you listeners that I'm now part of a really fantastic initiative, the Earbuds Podcast Network, which is a collective of awesome Melbourne-based podcasts, a very diverse range of voices and topics, and I'm really excited to be part of this new initiative. And I do highly encourage you to check out the Earbuds website and follow their Facebook page and check out some of the other podcasts on there. I'm really flattered to be part of such illustrious company. I'm also really excited to share a new episode of the podcast. It has been a little while. And I'm very excited to have Jim Chatto, who is someone that a lot of people have actually suggested I have as a guest on the show, but mostly because he is such an amazing winemaker and has been very present in terms of wine shows as a judge, and has an amazing wealth of knowledge and experience when it comes to Australian wines. So we spoke when he was in Melbourne not long ago. And it was great to hear about his background. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Please do stick around to find out how you can get in contact with both of us. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Jim, thank you very much for making some special time to be on the Vincast, particularly with, I've just found out, the momentous news, which we'll possibly come back to at some point. But thank you very much for being on the show. You've been someone who I've wanted to have on for a while. A number of people have actually said, "Oh, you should get Jim Chatto, and he'd be great a guest on the podcast." So thank you very much.
Oh, pleasure, James. I'm honoured and surprised that you had those requests. But yeah, no, I'm glad to be here.
Jim, I start every episode of the podcast by asking the same question of my guest, which is, can you remember if there was a particular occurrence in your life that made you think about wine in a different way that possibly led you on the path, or was it a sort of a gradual thing?
Well, I grew up in hospitality. Mum and Dad had a restaurant when I was a kid, so I certainly had lots of exposure to wine and food experiences growing up.
Yeah.
But there's something that does stick with me, and it really came to the front in my mind just last year. When I was a kid, I grew up in Canberra.
Right.
And Dad took me out to Edgar Reek's winery on Lake George. Edgar, unfortunately, just passed away last year, and that's why it sort of came to the forefront for me. But Dad took me out to his place a couple of times over the years, and I have this really strong memory of Edgar basically bouncing around his tiny barrel room on his property there, showing us samples from the barrels. And
how old were you?
I was a kid. I was 10,
right?
Maybe,
Okay,
something like that.
Yeah.
And just his enthusiasm.
Mm-hmm.
It was, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, it was almost childlike enthusiasm that I hadn't seen from adults.
Yeah.
Talking about what they do, and just that love for what he was doing and that excitement. It sort of caught me, in a sense, and it really caught my interest.
Wow. Okay. And as far as growing up and then, finishing school and going into further studies or not, did you have an idea about possibly following a path in the wine industry?
Well, I'd kind of forgotten about wine a little bit growing up. Dad was very keen. He's a chef.
Right.
He was very keen for me to get into wine. He thought it was probably a better career than being a chef, to have a family, etc. So he sort of...
Better hours apart from that one period of the year.
Yeah, of course. But for chefs, it's all year.
Yeah.
They work those hours. So he, subtly pushed me into it, introduced me to winemakers and wine industry people over the years. But because that's what his idea was, I kind of rejected that early and thought I'd do my own thing. And I actually had ideas on being a photographer, in fact.
Really?
That was sort of what I was studying at school, and thought I'd have a crack at that. I pretty quickly realised, although I was good at it, I wasn't great at it.
Right, okay.
And decided that wasn't for me.
Was it the technical side of things that you weren't proficient at, or you just sort of the composition?
I don't think I had an eye for it.
Right. Okay.
I think I was a bit too caught up in what I thought it should look like rather than seeing the picture, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
And
I think I know what you mean.
although I still love photography and I love great images, I can't capture them.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I like photography is like, any form of art really. You maybe have it in your mind's eye, but you can't quite get the composition right. So
and perhaps
I always have great respect for, even like photography. I have great respect for people who can do it.
Perhaps I could have worked hard and became a good photographer.
Sure.
But I guess my golden rule for myself is to be really good at whatever I decide to do.
Right.
So it had to be a natural fit.
And so deciding that you weren't going to follow that path.
Well, I ended up like everyone in our family. I ended up working for Dad, and I actually dropped out of school and started an apprenticeship with my dad as a chef. That lasted all of about 6 months. I think. I think after 6 months,
was it the work or working with Dad?
It was
or both.
I think it was working with Dad, and he didn't want me to be a chef. He made it pretty hard on me, but I think at the end of 6 months, he'd sacked me 5 times, and I'd quit 6 times. So I had one up on the ledger, but it convinced me to go back to school and study, and I sort of sat down and thought about what I might do. I was good at science. I wanted to make something.
Yeah,
I had that. I'd studied art and I'd done drama. Photography was there. I'd enjoyed the idea of making something, being creative.
Right. Okay.
And I was good at science, and I just thought about what was interesting, and wine was always there in the background growing up. And so I made some inquiries at Charles Stewart University. And went along for an open day and met some really cool, really interesting people, and that was it. I was hooked and enrolled.
Even at that age, did you kind of look at wine and think of it, breaking it down from a scientific perspective, but also kind of looking at it more of as an artistic pursuit in terms of the way you'd look at a picture or a painting or a sculpture and kind of be able to really admire and recognize the technique, but then the actual the art of it, the originality of it. Did you start to look at wine in that way? Yeah,
well, I mean, Dad showed me lots of wines growing up, and friends of his did as well, and they spoke about individual winemakers and their style, just like you'd speak about artists. So that resonated with me. I that was my image of what winemaking was. I figured it was a job. I think there was a certain alchemy to it. But certainly I saw more the creative side of it before the technical side of it.
Right, okay. What sort of wines were your parents into, or your dad, or what he served in his restaurants, and the wines you were kind of cutting your teeth on, so to speak?
Look, we went through some of his old menus from the 80s, and it's quite amazing. This was before photocopiers, late 70s, early 80s. And Mum and Dad actually got the first photocopier in the restaurant industry in Canberra, and they used to photocopy everyone else's menus for them.
Nice little side business.
Crazy. But all the menus were handwritten, and the wines they had on their list were just amazing and affordable. Great wines from Europe, from the old world. A good selection of Australian wines, but it was predominantly European wines.
Right.
And Mum still says she only drinks Montrachet with Chardonnay. Because that's what they had on by the glass in the restaurant.
Goodness
she doesn't get to drink it anymore. I should point out, but
who does?
But she always claims that.
I've had so many guests on the show complain about, oh my God, Burgundy, there's less of it and it's becoming more expensive. Wow. Okay. I mean, it's interesting that like there was a market for, I guess, more European wines. I mean, because Canberra politicians, I don't know, like business.
Yeah, look. I mean, I think a population that enjoyed eating out,
right,
and had a fair bit of expendable income. I think that was Canberra. It probably still is. I haven't lived there for nearly 30 years, but that's what it was like back then.
So, what was the career path? How did you kind of go? Okay, here's the first step into this industry. I'm keen to get into it. How did you go about it?
Well, I simply enrolled at Charles Stewart Uni and started the wine science course there.
Right.
I took jobs along the way, tried to get as much experience as I could.
Like as in winery or vineyard jobs?
Winery, so vintage jobs. I actually I took my first job in the Hunter Valley.
Yep.
Outside of uni, and interestingly, I applied for the job at Mount Pleasant back in 1993.
Wow.
And I'd seen the 1984 Lovedale Semillon at university.
Yeah.
In about 1990-91, so 6-7-year-old wine. I'd seen this wine and just was enamoured in how fresh and how bright it was. And I'd never seen a white wine at that age looking so fresh and bright. And so I wrote a letter to Phil Ryan, who was the winemaker at Mount Pleasant, and applied to come and do the vintage in the harvest in 1994.
Hunter Valley was pretty well, redeveloped at that point.
Yeah, look, Hunter then was, that's what I knew. I knew more about the Hunter, I think, because it was close enough to Canberra and Sydney.
Right.
So Dad used to go up there all the time, and took me on trips up there, that sort of thing. So it seemed like a logical place. Also, I think a lot of young university students end up in the Hunter for their first couple of vintages because it ties in beautifully with then getting back to university. So the harvest is over before the semester starts.
True. Yeah. And how did you find the experience of studying at Charles Sturt? Who were some of your classmates?
I'm still pretty good mates with. We're a tight little gang. Simon Black from Montalto down in Mornington. Geraldine McFall, who's at Willow Creek,
right,
in Mornington as well, incidentally, and Tobias Anstead, who's got his own brand, Anstead & Co, and he's based out near Bendigo.
Yep.
So we were sort of a tight little pack. There was a broader group, but I think we sort of stuck together and have remained good friends all this time.
Right. Did the Charles Sturt course become a bit bigger as time moved on? Like I would have thought that sort of through the late 90s and 2000s, with the expansion of the Australian wine industry, the demand for qualified winemakers would have increased a lot, and so there would have been a lot more people studying it.
Oh, look, definitely. I mean, it started as the Wagga, or the Riverina Ag College.
Yeah.
Wagga Ag College. And by the time I got there in the early 90s, it was a pretty serious course and well subscribed.
Yep.
Certainly after I left, and then consequently employing graduates and undergraduates, there seemed to be a lot more of them coming through, to the point that I remember in sort of mid-2000s or early 2000s even, we had a whole bunch of cellar hands in the winery at First Creek that were all qualified winemakers, but they were working as cellar hands.
Yeah.
So I think I was sort of lucky enough. I got in right at the tail end, just before the expansion really happened. So I was already in a job and establishing my career and I guess name as a winemaker, just as things were starting to really kick.
Wow. So, what was your first sort of full-time gig out of uni?
Tamburlaine in the Hunter Valley was never full-time. It was sort of, I did 3 years in a row. I used to vintage hop, do the Hunter harvest, and then over to Europe and work. Yep. So my first full-time job as a winemaker in charge, not reporting to another winemaker, was down in Tasmania in 1998. I went down as the inaugural winemaker for Roseviews Estate. Right.
Was Tasmania already starting to get a lot of interest, particularly as far as sparkling wines? Was that still early days?
It was very early days. Yeah. I think there'd been some good wines and interesting wines. You didn't hear a lot about it. I think the champions back then were Andrew Peary at Piper's Brook. He was certainly somebody I knew about. He'd been involved in writing part of the course for Charles Sturt.
Oh, wow.
As well. So I knew him from lecture notes, etc., etc. Claude Redenti down at Freycinet, Steve Lubiana, those guys were just sort of starting off there when I was at college.
Domain A?
Domain A, yep. A bit more established. Yeah. But it was certainly felt like it was emerging. Right. And that seemed pretty interesting. So, I was keen when a roll occurred down there.
How did you find the shift down to Tasmania? Significantly cooler climate than a lot of other Australian regions.
Oh, it was very different, and interestingly, I bought a couple of bags of tartaric acid, which are probably still in that winery today.
Lol, yeah.
They were never used. Look, I guess the biggest challenge for me is I came from the Hunter, and the Hunter is a really mature wine region in Australia.
Sure.
It's very, very collegiate in the way they operate. The winemakers work together really well there.
Yeah.
And that was something that wasn't there when I first moved to Tasmania.
Yeah.
It was still a very guarded industry, and I think that talks to a less mature industry.
Sure.
It was very guarded, and really the only guys that I could talk to get advice and learn from and share information and show my wines to were the two guys I mentioned, Claude Redenti in particular, and Steve Lubiana. They were the two younger guys that were in Tasmania at the time.
Right. Okay. Well, I know Steve had moved down to Tassie. Was Claude? Was he a Tasmanian?
No. Claude, I guess in a sense, married into it.
Right.
So his wife, Lindy, her father, Jeff Bull, founded Freycinet.
Right.
So
okay.
that was their family.
The reason I ask is because it's interesting that the three of you were sort of outsiders coming in to kind of to work on the wine. So I think that maybe that possibly is part of the reason there was a little bit more conviviality and support for each other.
I guess so. You're probably right, but it also was a very small industry, and outside of a couple of the key players, it was a cottage industry. It was essentially retired professionals with a piece of land.
Yep.
Now what can I do? I'm going to put it in a vineyard.
Yep.
And I guess the big change now, which is really exciting down there, is those vineyards are now 30 odd years old.
Yeah.
And those guys, their kids that have been working as professionals all around the world are now coming back.
Right.
And they're, coming back and taking ownership of those 30-year-old vineyards. So
and then taking that to the world.
And taking that to the next level. That's also attracting a whole new wave of young professionals to come to Tasmania.
Sure.
So, it is pretty exciting. I think the future's huge because you've got those vineyards, those mature vineyards, but they're not necessarily on the best sites and they're not necessarily with the best clones.
Sure.
So if we think forward another 10 years, 20 years, you're going to have wealth of knowledge and a real professional industry.
Yep.
You're going to have the best sites with the best matches of clones.
Yeah.
And I think that's when you...
And potentially other varieties?
And other varieties. Clones of Chardonnay, Pinot, whatever varieties. But
I know Chardonnay Pinot, awesome, love it.
But I think, I guess the varieties and/or clones most suited on the best sites.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
I'd argue that the best sites probably haven't been found in Tasmania yet.
I would think that possibly one of the other big differences between now and then is that there's a really vibrant tourism industry. I think particularly out of Hobart, something like Mona brings a lot of people into town, and I know for a fact that there's a really exciting food and wine scene in Hobart, and so that's potentially increasing visitation to wine regions, to wineries. I know for Steve, for example, at the Lubiana winery has a really lovely restaurant. And I think that's only going to bring more attention and exposure to the Tassie wines.
I mean, it's pretty exciting down there at the moment. It seems to be there's so much going on. It's so dynamic. There's people visiting all the time. We get so many because I've moved down there permanently now.
Yeah.
We're getting visitors weekly from the mainland. People on holiday asking for where to stay, where to go, what to do. All talking about I want to buy a block of land. I've found something down here, and I think it is. I think Mona's been really important for Tasmania.
Yeah.
And it's world class. It really, it's always been a destination, but it really makes it an international destination, I believe.
It feels so much less isolated now as
Definitely.
well. I think there are a lot more flights going down, for example, and so I think it's only an hour from Melbourne, so I think that it becomes a lot more desirable just to sort of go down for a weekend kind of thing. So that's another reason, it's not that far. Or if you are indeed commuting from Tassie as you are, it's 1 hour to Melbourne and then another hour to Sydney.
Well, that's right. I come into Melbourne regularly and do a day's work and get home, and I can, usually miss breakfast, but I usually can get home for dinner. So it's really easy from where I am.
So that first move down to Tassie was a pretty important time for you. Some pretty momentous things happened.
Well, definitely, it caught my eye. And I've said this before. I fell in love with Tasmanian Pinot, and I fell in love with the Tasmanian.
Yeah.
And both have stuck firmly. So yeah, I moved down in '98, and I moved back to the mainland in 2000.
Right.
My girlfriend, now wife Daisy, was ready to leave Tasmania and explore the bigger world.
Sure.
And I had a really interesting opportunity to go back as a more senior winemaker in a company in the Hunter Valley. So we both sort of jumped at that. It was meant to be a 3-year contract. Some 17 years later, we've finally moved back.
Okay, so back to the Hunter, senior role, you were taking a bit more ownership, getting to know the region a little bit better. How did you feel that Hunter Valley was evolving in that time?
Oh, it was moving fast. And, when I came in, there was still, if I can call it the old guard, were there, and they probably were the young guys 20 years prior, etc.
Sure.
But there was a real changing of the guard, if you like, and all of a sudden, within a few years, the young guys and girls like myself were suddenly in charge of wineries, and I guess challenging ideas, challenging style, and I guess reflecting on what we're doing well and what can be improved. So it was a pretty exciting time.
Yeah, and I'm assuming you had a love for Semillon, of course. Shiraz, a big fan of Hunter Shiraz?
Well, I am, and there was a time when it wasn't fashionable to say so, but I've great Hunter Shiraz. I think is so unique and so important in the world of wine. It's funnily, it's on style right now. It's that medium-bodied style.
Yeah.
The Cool Climate Shiraz guys, it's very similar style. Their Shiraz is more spicy.
Sure.
Hunter's more savoury.
Yeah.
But just that medium body, that great balance of Hunter wines, and I'd challenge any Australian region to match Hunter Reds for longevity.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I've opened up some Hunter Shiraz on my YouTube channel. With a bit of age, and they still look fresh, but they have this really interesting kind of umami character that I really respond to. So I'm keen to sort of look at some older examples as well. And as far as at that point, were you getting into the market, as it were, and being able to talk to influencers and media and stuff like that? How was Australian wine in general kind of evolving at that time for you?
Well, I guess when I was first into the industry, it was bigger, better, best.
Yeah.
And with red wine in particular.
Yeah.
And I think we're all chasing those big blockbuster Aussie styles that we'd essentially sold to the world.
Sure.
The concept of Australian red wine. So that's tough when you're a winemaker in the Hunter Valley, because you're making medium-bodied savoury wines, not big, juicy, rich, full-bodied wines.
Yeah.
So it was a tough business getting out there in the trade. And I remember, my first few times down in Victoria, and in Melbourne in particular, selling Hunter wines. It was really hard work. I found it really hard work. Right now, it's the exact opposite. It's amazing.
Interesting.
When I was working at Pepper Tree Wines, which has a portfolio broader than the Hunter, they have Coonawarra and Rattenbully as well. And I remember going into the trade for the first time with Pepper Tree. This was in about 2007. And, we took down with our distributor, local distributor, took a whole bunch of Coonawarra and Rattenbully wines. And the first thing I was asked is, where are the Hunter wines?
Wow.
And I was quite shocked. And I said, I'll be back next month with the Hunter wines. And that was sort of the turning point, I think, where particularly down here in Victoria, where people started to recognise what's special about Hunter Valley wine.
Do you think that and considering that your dad was a chef and can appreciate that, do you think that has a little bit to do with the changing tastes and drinking behaviour, where people were kind of thinking more about wine that is better with food, and like looking at a really bombastic Barossa Shiraz or McLaren Vale Grenache or Coonawarra Cabernet, that they kind of
kind of overwhelmed food, and maybe that kind of that shift in the scene in Melbourne possibly led to a bit more interest in those hunter styles because they were a little bit more effective in terms of matching with food.
Oh, look, certainly. I think, even in my lifetime, we've in Australia come a long way with cuisine and occasion and how we pair things. So I think that's critical, and I think that's why you've seen the rise of cool climate Shiraz and of Pinot, etc. Because these are light to medium bodied red wines, and they're generally more versatile, and I guess more sympathetic to eating.
Yeah.
You know?
So when did you get the opportunity to make the shift to McWilliams?
That came about in, the conversation started back in 2008, in fact.
Right.
I was doing a little bit of consulting work for McWilliams, sourcing Pinot from Tasmania.
Oh, right.
And, I'd started to source a bit of fruit and link them up with a few vineyards. And that was all through Jim Brain, who was a long time ago the chief winemaker at McWilliams, but these days he's the chairman of the company.
Right.
And I'd met Jim through the wine shows over the years, and he approached me. I think I was the only bloke he really knew that knew anything about Tasmania at the time. So we started sort of pairing up some things. They then employed Corey Ryan as their group winemaker out of Villa Maria in New Zealand. And I sort of disappeared off into the distance. But then in 2012, I had a client who I'd convinced to take their winemaking to McWilliams. They had a nice synergy with the Hilltops and also with Tumbarumba.
Sure.
And I convinced them to take their winemaking there. And just in a blending session with the McWilliams winemaking team, I just asked, what's happening with Mount Pleasant. Because I'm in the Hunter and I'm really interested in Mount Pleasant. And Phil Ryan had recently retired, but there was no sort of announcement about who was going to take over that pattern.
No succession plan.
Yeah, so I just quite candidly asked the question, and Jim Brain looked at me and said, "Why do you want the job?" It was as simple as that.
Wow, there you go. So Mount Pleasant runs sort of independently of McWilliams. It's like a separate winery.
Oh, look, it's a separate winery, but it's owned by the McWilliams family.
Right.
It has been since the 40s.
Sure.
Well, they took a half share in 1932, so it's not a new venture for them.
It was that was like a cash injection for Maurice, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, a bit of both. I think McWilliams were looking to diversify out into premium winemaking.
Yeah.
At the time, being based in the Riverina.
Yeah.
And I think it was an opportunity for both parties in that sense. They then put further cash into the business and took control of the business, but kept Maurice on as the manager.
Yeah.
On the site until he died in 1956.
Yeah. I mean, it's I have read Campbell's fantastic book.
Oh, it's excellent.
I couldn't put that down. I read that in I think a day. So I have a lot of interest in Mount Pleasant, and I can imagine that it must have been a somewhat daunting kind of proposition stepping into that role, because I believe you were only the fourth chief winemaker for Mount Pleasant since Maurice.
Yes, you're right. So
big shoes to fill.
Oh, certainly. I've been wearing 3 pairs of socks ever since. But look. As I referred to earlier, I discovered Mount Pleasant at university.
Yeah.
And I applied for my first ever job there.
Yeah.
I didn't get the job, but ironically, some 20 years later, I got the job, so to speak. So it's always...
I think we still have your CV on file.
I don't think they did. But it's always been a vineyard. I've been jealous of their resources, if you like.
Sure.
They're great red vineyards and that Lovedale vineyard. And it's always, some of the vineyards have been part of I call them barometer blocks,
right,
if you like. And, where during harvest I might jump the fence and go and have a taste and see how they're tracking. And it helps put the whole region in perspective for me. But
right,
more importantly, the vineyards that I'm making wine from.
Sure.
So, I mean, by the time I came on board for the 2013 vintage, I'd been looking at that Lovedale vineyard for nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
Every year, and tasting the grapes, at harvest time, that sort of thing. So I'd sort of been, I guess, mapping how I'd make it if I had the opportunity in my head. And
You've got your cheat sheets already, so you can step in and just ace the exam.
well, it was a funny,
not quite.
It was a funny first moment in 2013. So I was there with Jim Brain and Scott McWilliam, and we were going through the vineyard talking about how to pick it. And Scott had sort of said, "Well, we've been doing this quadrant. We've been picking in this quadrant, the old block of Lovedale, which was planted in 1946." And I said, "Oh, I reckon we should pick it differently." And he looked at me like, who's this guy? and I said, "Oh, no disrespect at all, Scott, but I've been coming in here for 20 years.
Yeah,
been looking at this vineyard, and I think actually the flavour changes more as you move down the block rather than in these 4 quadrants." And I said, "Well, look, let me just pick one parcel out, and we'll make that separately and see how it goes." And it's the 2013 Lovedale.
there you go.
Ironically, well, not ironically, but nicely.
Now I think you mentioned before about wine shows. You've been pretty involved with wine shows for a long time. How did you kind of get into wine show judging? Was it a Len Evans thing by any chance?
Well, I guess it was, and I've got a Len Evans story from my first wine show. But a local winemaker who was an associate judge for some reason couldn't make the Hunter Valley Wine Show. This was in 1998, so nearly 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I got the call up, and I was pretty excited, but I didn't know what I'd be doing. I had no idea at all. So I went and spoke to the only bloke I knew that knew anything about wine shows, and that was Neil McGuigan.
Right.
And Neil sort of looked me up and down and said, "Look at you, Jim. If you can't be a good judge, sure, you want to look like one. Wear a tie." And I thought, okay, wear a tie. That's okay. Thanks for that, Neil. Like, really, that's interesting information. I look like a ragamuffin. I better wear a tie. So on the first day of the show, I was waiting to be picked up by a couple of mates, Al Sutherland, who's unfortunately passed away, formerly of Saxonvale, and Kappa Cayley, and Andrew Thomas, who's still in the Hunter Valley today. And those guys picked me up on the side of the road to head out to the Singleton Army base for the show. And I noticed they weren't wearing ties. So, the 40-minute trip out to the show, they gave it to me on every angle possible about wearing a tie. And when I turned up at the show and all the other judges were there, I noticed nobody was wearing a tie. And save Len Evans, who was wearing a tie, being the chairman of the show. And during his, I guess, preamble to the judges, he sort of walked around all the judges, talking as he would, and he stopped at me and proceeded to straighten my tie. And, said out quite loudly to all the other judges, "Good to see somebody wearing a tie," and then whispered to me, "Are you after my job?"
Oh, wow.
Which I thought was kind of ironic because in 2012 I did take over as chairman of the Hunter Valley Wine Show, and I relayed that story at the award ceremony.
So I guess sort of rising up through the ranks of the show judging system, how have you kind of seen they've changed, and are they kind of staying on trends, and how are they kind of trying to stay relevant in the changing wine market?
I think by being more inclusive. When I first came into judging, and it was already starting to change when I first came into judging, but when I first came into judging, the typical Australian wine show judge was a 40-year-old winemaker, generally a 40-year-old male winemaker from one of the large companies.
Sure.
And that was the judge. And there might have been a token journalist, maybe a token retailer, and an international judge.
Right.
These days, it's a whole different mix. And it's guys and girls, which is fantastic. It's people from all different walks of the wine life, media, retailers, sommeliers, restaurateurs, winemakers, the whole lot are there. And so you're getting all sorts of different ideas and different experiences coming into the discussion. And I think that's what keeps it relevant, is having that whole mix of ideas. And I still think it is really important. And a lot of the trends I see out in the marketplace, although you first see them as a consumer in the wine bars around the place, but the ideas first sort of pop up in the wine shows. and challenging ideas and the discussions that happen in the wine shows. Then I've seen that sort of really kick off in the wine bars, and then it sort of becomes more mainstream sort of 3 to 5 years later. So I think they're still really quite relevant, and things we're discussing in the wine shows, and that's what we're there for. The people are there, they're all volunteers. They're there because they love wine, they love Australian wine, and they're all keen to explore what that is and really push the boundaries.
As far as sort of one of the main ideas about the wine show system is as far as improving the breed, as it were, I guess going back to the kind of the agricultural show kind of concept, do you think that it's possibly changed a little bit and now there is some promotion of a bit of diversity as well, and not sort of saying this grape variety from this region should look like this, and sort of saying, well, let's sort of take a step back and actually say, well, firstly, is it of quality, and then, is it representative of this or this? Do you think that that's kind of coming into it a little bit as well?
I think there's almost an analogy for a nascent wine judge or a young wine judge and the way the wine show system started.
Yeah.
And I think, the adage of improving the breed, I think was good to a point. Now it's about expanding our horizons, if you like. And generally when a young judge comes in, or a young wine taster comes into the industry, they judge on style.
Sure.
They're completely style focused, and they all completely miss quality, because they're judging in a box of style.
Right.
And I think as you mature as a wine taster, and this goes for consumers as well, but as you mature on your journey with wine, you learn to appreciate quality across style. And I think that's where the wine shows are heading, where they're saying, it's not just, a template for what is great Shiraz, but great Shiraz in Australia can be savoury, medium-bodied Hunter Shiraz. It can be juicy, full-bodied Barossa Shiraz, and everything in between.
Yeah.
And I think, once judges and wine shows feel, I guess, empowered to find great examples of all of those, it makes it so much better.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I completely agree with you as well. So in spite of, the amazing opportunity as far as working at Mount Pleasant, Tasmania did kind of lure you back a little bit. And so you started your own little project as well with the Chatto Wines.
Yeah, look, I never left Tasmania. Okay. I never left Tasmania, and I never will.
From the wine perspective, I guess.
Yeah. I mean physically, and
okay.
from the wine perspective.
Right, okay.
I just fell in love with the intensity and the purity of the fruit.
Yep.
And I hadn't seen that anywhere else. And it's not just grapes. You go down there in summer and try all the berry fruits, the raspberries, the cherries, blackberries, the whole lot. There's just so much intensity of flavour.
Yep.
And, that to me caught my eye, and it still does with the wine. The winemaking there is pretty easy because there's so much intensity of flavour.
Sure. And purity, as you say.
Yeah.
It's a shame that New Zealand kind of took the ownership of that word. I think Tasmania should have taken it.
Yes.
So how did you approach the Chatto Wines?
Well, I started it with a bit of a false start, if you like, back in 2000.
Right.
Where I bought a bit of fruit locally and made a bit of wine, and I had a couple of partners in the business because I was being paid a pittance as a young winemaker.
Yeah.
And that sort of went along for about 6 years, and we sold the wine, but we didn't make any money, and it was really hard to fund growth and buy the barrels and buy the bottles and the labels, that sort of thing. So we were making it and selling it, doing a lot of work for the love of it, which was okay. But one of the partners wanted to see some better returns, and that it ended up sort of
partners tend to do that.
It ended up collapsing in on itself, and in all that time, Daisy and I had been looking for a property in Tasmania, and I'd focused primarily on the north of Tasmania, Tamar, because that's where I'd worked and that's what I knew.
Sure.
But in that sort of search and getting married down there as well, we fell in love with the south, and I sort of sat down and thought about my favourite 5 Tasmanian Pinots I'd ever tried, and 3 of them were from the Huon Valley.
Yeah, right.
And, so that sort of cut it for me.
Fair enough. And how is since then? How has the Chatto Wines story kind of evolved?
Well, we we did originally, as I said, search in the Tamar, but we eventually found a little north-facing block in the Huon, a little place called Glazier's Bay.
Yeah.
And it just seemed too perfect. It was north-facing block with water views, and it had been an apple orchard in a previous incarnation. But it just sort of ticked all the boxes for us. It wasn't too big. I didn't want to spend 7 days a week on a vineyard every day of the week. I wanted to be out talking about my wines and telling the story of my wine and showing my wine to people.
Yeah.
As much as I love gardening and I love being in a vineyard, I wanted that opportunity to get out there as well.
You didn't want it to be at the sacrifice of being cut off.
I was a winemaker by training.
Sure.
So for me, viticulture, although I'd studied at university, I hadn't practiced it in great depth for a lot of years, and so it was an opportunity to relearn viticulture.
Sure.
And do that for myself. So we bought a property in 2006 and set about planting the vineyard in 2007.
Right. So they're starting to hit their stride. It's not quite reaching maturity yet, but in 10 more years.
Oh yeah. Well, I guess a long way off. I joked to somebody that hopefully one of my daughters or both of them will end up making the best wines off our property.
That is every winemaker's dream, I think, is that their children will hopefully follow on their footsteps, especially if you have a vineyard and you want them to tend it with as much love and attention as you do.
Well, and a vineyard's a long game, and that's been really brought home to me being at Mount Pleasant, where our vineyards there go back to 1880.
Yeah, of course.
It's a long game.
That's legacy.
It's a really long game, and so I think I found a great little site down in the Huon Valley, and I think we're making some lovely wines in the early days.
Yeah,
which to me is really promising and gratifying. That people enjoy them as well, but ultimately, I'm hoping for big things for that site, likely beyond my tenure, my life, even.
And Tasmania is about to become even more important in your professional life with, I believe, the very recent news of you working with Kreglinger. And so you'll be spending a bit more time making some wine down in Tassie. But that's exciting. It's interesting to see what's going to happen there.
Yeah. Well, just announced today, I've taken a role as the Chief Winemaker for the Kreglinger Group. Which has Piper's Brook in Tasmania. It also has Norfolk Rise in the Limestone Coast. But the big vineyard holding and part of the business is based in the north of Tasmania at Piper's Brook, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, and I mean, just speaking from a sparkling wine perspective, Tasmania was always kind of top of the list for me, and I always had a soft spot for the Kreglinger sparkling wines. I thought they were fantastic and underappreciated.
Oh, look, definitely. And I think when I first came down to Tassie in 1998, Piper's was the undisputed leader.
Yeah.
For innovation and quality. Those guys were ahead of the game on everyone else. I think the industry's grown up a lot in sort of nearly 20 years since then. As I mentioned, there's a whole raft of professionals coming in. There's new sites, there's new clones, there's new ideas. It's such a good dynamic, and I think Piper's, if I'm honest, got a little bit left behind there for a while.
Right.
And I sort of came on board with them in a small way over the last couple of years, just sort of helping the winemaking team tweak the blends and their approaches to how they made the wines and that sort of thing. And we're seeing some nice little incremental improvements. And now it's an opportunity to really dial that up.
One of the things that I've been seeing recently with Tasmanian wine that's been very exciting is that, I'm starting to see a bit more diversity. Like 10 years ago, I kind of would look at Tasmanian wine as all being fairly similar, with the exception of a handful of producers. Tasmanian Chardonnay, Tasmanian Pinot tasted fairly similar, but recently I've been seeing a lot of really different expressions, and I think it is an exciting time for Tasmanian wine. And I know that I've had a couple of guests on the podcast who are, like yourself, at that forefront of bringing Tasmanian wine and bring it into the 21st century and beyond, and putting their hand up. My most recent guest was Greg Lambrecht, the inventor of the Coravan device, and he said, I love Tasmanian wine, and I know that that's a big part of that is the exciting stuff that's happening down there. So I'm really interested to see what's going to happen with the new role, and obviously there's already an opportunity for all the listeners to be able to drink wines made by yourself with Mount Pleasant and with the Chatto Wines. But I want to say thank you very much for making some time. It has been really fascinating to find out a bit more about your background, and there are ways for people to find out more about the Chatto Wines online.
Well, funny timing, because today's actually our launch of our 2016s.
There you go.
So I don't do anything in halves, everything all on the same day. But so we've just released our 2016s, and Daisy's on the computer, manning the phones, taking charge of it. It's been, the support's been fantastic since we started the Chatto project. And it's, I think, the black label, our single vineyard wine's almost sold out on the first day of release.
Wow.
Which is fantastic.
Yeah. But yeah, our listeners, I guess, find out more about the Chatto Wines online, follow them on social media, and please do let Jim know that you enjoyed this episode. But I'm looking forward to catching up again soon.
Thanks, James. It's been a pleasure. Cheers.
And thank you, listeners, for joining me on another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and you can follow me on social media on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I am at Intrepid Wino, and you can follow the podcast on Twitter at the Vincast. I'd love for you to subscribe to the podcast on any number of different platforms, whether it's iTunes, Player FM, Podbean, Stitcher. Subscribing means you get the newest episode as soon as it becomes available. And on those platforms, it's a great way to share feedback by leaving me a rating and review, which also helps to grow the audience. So I really do appreciate anyone who makes the time to leave me a rating and a review. You can come and visit me at intrepidwino.com. There's lots of different content, like videos and writings I've done in the past, and lots of different ways of getting in contact with me as well. Again, I would love for you to check out some of the other podcasts in the Earbuds Network, which can be found at earbudsnetwork.com. But until next time, guys, bye.
Earbuds, Melbourne's podcast network. earbudsnetwork.com